The rhythmic clanking of metal and the steady hum of machinery filled the air as the factory workers moved about, each engrossed in their task. It was just another busy evening at the steel manufacturing plant, one of the largest in the city. The massive structure stood tall, a beacon of industry and hard work. Inside, sparks flew as molten metal was molded into shape, the air thick with the scent of oil and iron. Among the crowd of workers, an older man moved quietly, his clothes dusty, his hands rough from years of labor. His face, though marked with age, carried a certain wisdom, a quiet strength. No one paid him much attention. To them, he was just another laborer, perhaps a little slower than the rest, but nothing special. But if they had looked closer, they would have seen the depth in his eyes, the gaze of a man who had seen both fortune and struggle, a man who understood the value of every drop of sweat that fell onto the factory floor. His name was Iqbal, a humble farmer from a nearby village. He wasn't here for the money, nor for the job. He was here for something much deeper, something more personal. Iqbal's son, Adnan, was the owner of this very factory. A self-made businessman, Adnan had built the empire from the ground up. But despite his success, he had never forgotten his roots. He respected hard work, just as his father had taught him. And it was for this reason that Iqbal had come here, not as the father of a wealthy man, but as a simple worker. He wanted to experience firsthand the life of those who worked under his son, to see if they were treated fairly, if they were respected. He had chosen to keep his identity a secret, blending in with the workers, watching, observing. For days, he had been working quietly, listening to the chatter around him. Some workers spoke of their struggles, some of their families, while others whispered about the factory's supervisors, men who had power but lacked compassion. And then there were the rumors, stories of mistreatment, of workers being pushed beyond their limits, of voices being silenced. Iqbal had heard enough. He knew he had to stay longer, to see for himself whether these whispers held any truth. Then one evening everything changed. A loud voice echoed through the factory, cutting through the sounds of grinding metal and roaring flames. "Hey, old man! You think you can take it easy just because you're slow?" The voice belonged to Raza, one of the factory supervisors. He was a tall man with a sharp gaze, his presence commanding fear rather than respect. He had noticed Iqbal struggling to carry a heavy load and took it as an opportunity to assert his authority. Iqbal straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm doing my best, son," he said calmly, his voice steady. "Your best isn't good enough," Raza snapped. "You're slowing everyone down. Maybe you should find a job that suits your age, like feeding chickens back in your village." A few workers chuckled nervously, avoiding eye contact with the older man. They had seen what happened to those who talked back. Iqbal didn't react. He simply nodded and continued his work. But Raza wasn't done. He stepped forward, shoving the older man back. "I said you're too slow," he growled, his voice laced with irritation. Iqbal stumbled but didn't fall. He steadied himself, his grip tightening around the metal he was carrying. A few workers stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold. Some looked away, afraid to get involved. Others whispered amongst themselves. "Why are you just standing there?" Raza barked, his anger rising. "You think you're special. You think you don't have to follow my rules." Iqbal looked at him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Respect is earned, son. Not forced," he said simply. That was enough to push Raza over the edge. Without warning, he grabbed Iqbal by the collar, his face inches from the older man's. "You really don't know who you're messing with, old man," he sneered. "I can have you thrown out of here in seconds." The factory grew silent. The workers held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. No one dared to interfere. But just as Raza tightened his grip, a new voice cut through the tension. "Let him go." The voice was sharp, authoritative, one that demanded immediate attention. The workers turned, their eyes widening in shock. Standing at the entrance, dressed in a crisp suit, was Adnan. His expression was unreadable, but there was an undeniable fire in his eyes. Raza froze, confusion flashing across his face. "Sir, I was just..." "You were just what?" Adnan interrupted, stepping forward. His gaze flickered to his father, then back to Raza. "Do you even know who this man is?" Raza hesitated. He's just a worker," he muttered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Adnan let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver through the room, he said, "This man is my father." The color drained from Raza's face. The factory workers gasped. A heavy silence fell over the room as realization struck. The man they had ignored, the man they had seen struggling alongside them, was not just another worker. He was the father of the very man who owned this factory. Iqbal stood still, watching his son. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes, something only Adnan could understand. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something deeper, something more powerful. Adnan turned to the workers, his voice firm. "This factory was built with hard work, with honesty, and with respect. If anyone here thinks they can mistreat another human being and get away with it, they are mistaken." He paused, letting his words sink in before turning back to Raza. "You think power comes from fear. You think being in charge means you can treat people like they are nothing." Raza swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. "Sir, Enough," Adnan cut him off. "I will deal with you later." But before he could say another word, Iqbal placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Not now, beta," he said softly. "Let's not act in anger." Adnan looked at his father, his heart heavy with emotion. He had never seen his father as just another worker, but he now realized the depth of his wisdom. The factory remained silent, waiting, watching. What would happen next? Would justice be served? Would Raza face the consequences of his actions? And more importantly, what lesson had this moment taught everyone in that room? One thing was certain: nothing in that factory would ever be the same again. The weight of silence in the factory was heavier than the steel beams stacked along the walls. Every worker stood frozen, their eyes shifting between Adnan, his father, and Raza. No one had ever seen the factory owner so angry, so intense. The realization that the old man they had overlooked, some had even mocked, was the father of the most powerful man in the building made their stomachs twist with guilt. Iqbal, however, remained calm. His face showed no sign of pride or satisfaction, only a quiet wisdom that had been earned over decades of hard work. He had not come here to create fear, nor had he expected his secret to be revealed like this. He only wanted to see the truth. And now, standing in the middle of the factory floor, he had seen enough. Raza, the once arrogant supervisor, stood stiffly, his hands clenched at his sides. His face was pale, his mind racing for a way out. He had ruled over the workers through fear, believing his position gave him unquestioned power. But in a single moment, that illusion had shattered. He glanced around, looking for support, but none of the workers dared to meet his eyes. The ones who had once laughed at his jokes now stayed quiet. Even his closest allies stepped back, distancing themselves. Adnan's gaze remained locked onto Raza, his jaw tight. But then, slowly, he turned toward his father. "Baba," he said, his voice quieter now. "Why didn't you tell me?" Iqbal sighed, brushing some dust off his worn-out kurta. "Would you have let me work here if I had?" Adnan's throat tightened. He already knew the answer. Of course he wouldn't have allowed it. "You didn't have to do this." Iqbal shook his head. "I did." He glanced at the workers, his eyes softening. "How else would I have known their truth?" The workers shifted uncomfortably. The truth. That was the very thing many of them had chosen to ignore. Some of them had been working here for years, suffering under the weight of Raza's leadership but too afraid to speak up. They had accepted his cruelty as a part of the job, convincing themselves that nothing could change. Now, faced with Iqbal's quiet yet powerful presence, they realized how much they had allowed. Raza swallowed hard and finally found his voice. "Sir, I didn't know." Adnan held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's the problem, Raza," he said coldly. "You didn't know. You didn't care to know." His words were sharp, like a blade cutting through the air. "This man has spent his life working harder than you could ever imagine. He has built with his hands what others can only dream of. And yet you saw him as weak. Why?" Raza opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? That he had judged Iqbal by his worn-out clothes, by his slow movements, by the lines on his face that told a story of years spent under the sun. Iqbal exhaled, looking away. "Enough, Adnan," he said gently. "Let's not humiliate anyone further." Adnan clenched his jaw. Even now, his father refused to let anger take control. He turned away from Raza, his eyes scanning the faces of the workers. "How many of you have been mistreated here?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. No one spoke at first. But then, hesitantly, one man raised his hand. Then another. Then another. Adnan felt his chest tighten. He had trusted this factory to be a place of dignity, of fairness. But now he saw the truth, just as his father had. Iqbal studied the workers' faces, their hesitation, their fear. "Why didn't you speak up before?" A man from the back cleared his throat. We thought it wouldn't make a difference." His voice was quiet, but his words hit hard. Adnan closed his eyes for a moment, ashamed that he had not seen this sooner. "It does make a difference," he said firmly. "It always does." He turned back to Raza, who stood stiffly, still searching for a way out of this. "I'm giving you one chance to explain yourself." Raza hesitated, licking his lips nervously. "Sir, I only wanted to keep discipline. I didn't mean to." "Discipline?" Adnan cut him off. "Is that what you call shoving an old man? Mocking workers? Making people afraid to speak?" Raza's breathing grew unsteady. "I was just following what I thought was right." Iqbal watched him carefully. "And now? Do you still think it was right?" Raza opened his mouth, but then closed it again. His confidence had shattered, leaving behind only regret and fear. Iqbal sighed. "People make mistakes," he said, his voice steady. "But the real mistake is not learning from them." He looked at the workers. "And the real tragedy is when good people stay silent." The factory remained still, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The workers looked at Iqbal with new eyes, not as a weak old man, but as someone who had reminded them of something they had forgotten, their own worth. Adnan took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "Things are going to change here," he said, his voice firm. "From today, no worker will be treated like this again." He turned back to Raza. "You will answer for what you've done. But not here. Not now." Raza nodded quickly, his face pale. Iqbal gave his son a small nod of approval but said nothing. His work here was done. As the night deepened, the factory workers slowly returned to their duties, but the air was different now. The weight of fear had lifted, replaced by something new. "Oh." Iqbal turned to his son, a small smile playing at his lips. "Now let's go home." And with that, the humble farmer walked away, leaving behind a factory, and a lesson that no one would ever forget. The night outside was calm, the air carrying a faint scent of iron and grease from the factory. Iqbal walked beside his son, his pace steady despite the weight of the evening's events. Adnan remained silent, his thoughts tangled. His father had uncovered something he had failed to see for so long, the fear within his own factory. How had he missed it? How had Raza managed to turn a place built on hard work into something people dreaded? As they reached the parking lot, Adnan finally spoke. "Baba, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Iqbal glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Would you have believed me?" Adnan hesitated. He wanted to say yes, but deep down he knew the truth. He had been so caught up in the business side of things, the numbers, the production rates, the expansion plans, that he had overlooked the people who made it all possible. "I thought I had good people managing everything," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "I trusted them." Iqbal nodded, his gaze fixed on the factory behind them. "Trust is important, Beta. But blind trust." He shook his head. "That can be dangerous." Adnan let out a slow breath. "I need to fix this." Iqbal placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Then start by listening." The words settled deep into Adnan's chest. He had built this business with a vision, just as his father had built his farm, with honesty and hard work. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. As they drove home, neither of them spoke much. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with realization. The next morning, Adnan arrived at the factory earlier than usual. The workers were already moving about, but something was different. Their movements were slower, hesitant, as if they were unsure of what to expect. Whispers filled the air, and when Adnan stepped inside, conversations hushed. He walked straight to his office, but instead of sitting behind his desk, he stood in the middle of the floor where all the workers could see him. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "I know what's been happening here," he said, his voice steady. "And I know many of you have been afraid to speak up." A few workers exchanged glances but remained quiet. "I'm not here to make promises I can't keep," Adnan continued. "But I will say this, things will change." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of curiosity and doubt. "I will be personally looking into every complaint," Adnan said. "No more mistreatment. No more silence." The workers stood still, unsure whether to believe him. They had heard promises before, seen temporary improvements that faded over time. But something about the way Adnan spoke, about the way his father had stood among them the night before, made them feel that this time things might be different. Just then a voice spoke up from the back. It was a boss, an older worker who had been at the factory since the early days. He stepped forward, his face lined with years of experience. "And what about Raza?" he asked. His voice was calm, but the question carried weight. Adnan met his gaze. "He will be dealt with." A boss nodded slowly. "And the others?" Adnan's jaw tightened. He knew Raza hadn't been acting alone. There were others, other supervisors who had followed his lead, who had allowed the mistreatment to continue. If real change was going to happen, it couldn't stop with just one man. "I will look into every person in a position of power here," he said firmly. "No one will be above accountability." Another murmur spread through the crowd, this time with a different energy. It wasn't fear, it was something closer to hope. As Adnan turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his father standing near the entrance, watching. Iqbal said nothing, but his small nod was enough. But not everyone in the factory was pleased. In a small, dimly lit room at the back of the factory, Raza sat hunched over, his fists clenched. Two other supervisors, Zubair and Kamran, stood nearby, their faces tense. "This is bad," Kamran muttered. "He's going to start investigating everything." "We have to do something," Zubair added. "If he finds out about—" He stopped himself, his eyes darting to Raza. Raza's face darkened. He had spent years building his control over the workers, making sure they stayed in line. He had connections, arrangements that no one questioned. If Adnan started digging too deep, everything could unravel. "We won't let that happen," Raza said, his voice low. Kamran and Zubair exchanged wary glances. "What are you planning?" Kamran asked. Raza leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We remind them why they kept quiet in the first place." A chill settled in the room. The factory may have been changing, but not everyone was ready to let go of their power so easily. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, a storm was already beginning to form, one that neither Adnan nor Iqbal could see coming. The factory floor was different now. There was an unspoken shift in the air, a strange mixture of hope and unease. The workers moved with a little more confidence, their voices no longer completely hushed. But beneath this newfound energy, there was also fear of what would happen next. Because while Adnan had made promises of change, Raza and his allies were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment. Iqbal, ever observant, could sense it. He saw the way some of the supervisors still carried themselves with arrogance, how certain workers avoided eye contact as if afraid of being watched. Change had begun, but resistance was growing. And Iqbal knew from years of experience, when power is threatened, it doesn't surrender easily. Adnan, determined to follow through on his word, had been spending more time at the factory, speaking with workers, listening to their concerns. He had already dismissed 2 supervisors for mistreatment, but Raza was a bigger problem. Unlike the others, Raza wasn't just a bully. He was calculating. He had built his influence over the years, securing favors, keeping people under his control. He knew things about this factory, things that could cause damage if revealed. Late one evening, as most of the workers had left and only the night shift remained, Iqbal stayed behind. He wanted to see how the factory operated when no one was watching. He walked along the narrow pathways between the machines, his eyes scanning everything: the workers, the supervisors, the way things moved when Adnan wasn't there. That's when he saw something that made his stomach tighten. In a corner of the storage area, a group of workers were speaking in hushed voices. Iqbal moved closer, keeping to the shadows. They were talking about something being transported out of the factory, something that wasn't on the records. He recognized one of the voices immediately. It was Cameron, one of Raza's men. "We need to move it before morning," Cameron whispered urgently. "If Adnan finds out, it's over." Iqbal's heart pounded. Move what? What were they hiding? Carefully he stepped back, not wanting to be seen. He needed to tell Adnan. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just mistreatment, it was something deeper, something dangerous. But before he could take another step, a rough hand grabbed his arm. Iqbal turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Raza stood before him, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Cameron and Zubair watched silently. Well, Raza said, his voice low. "The old man just can't keep his nose out of things, can he?" Iqbal didn't flinch. "What are you hiding?" he asked calmly. Raza's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You should have stayed out of this, Baba. This isn't your business." Iqbal held his ground. "This factory is built on hard work. It's not yours to exploit." Raza sighed, shaking his head. "You don't understand how things work here. Some rules are just for show." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "But since you're so interested, maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private." Iqbal didn't like the way Raza said that. He took a step back, but Cameron and Zubair blocked his path. "Don't make this difficult," Raza warned. "You've caused enough trouble already." Iqbal's fists tightened. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had faced tougher men in his lifetime. But he was afraid for what this meant. If they were willing to go this far, then whatever they were hiding was serious. And if Adnan wasn't warned in time, it could ruin everything. Before he could react, Raza signaled to his men, and the world around Iqbal suddenly turned dark as a heavy sack was pulled over his head. Back in his office, Adnan paced restlessly. His father had promised to check in before leaving, but there was no sign of him. Something didn't feel right. He reached for his phone, dialing Iqbal's number. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. His stomach twisted with unease. His father was never careless. If he wasn't answering, something was wrong. Without wasting another second, Adnan grabbed his keys and rushed out, his mind racing with possibilities. He had to find his father. And deep down, he already knew where to start looking. Adnan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped toward the factory. His heart pounded harder with each passing second. His father's silence wasn't normal, and after everything that had happened with Raza, He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When he reached the factory gates, the night guard waved him down. "Sir, you're back," the man asked hesitantly. "Your father left hours ago, didn't he?" Adnan's stomach dropped. His father had never left. He stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the dimly lit factory yard. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but he knew better. Ignoring the guard's confused expression, Adnan walked briskly toward the back of the factory, where the storage areas were located. He pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped inside. The smell of machine oil and dust filled the air. The lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows along the walls. Then he noticed something unusual: a few wooden crates stacked against the far wall, covered with a tarp. These weren't part of the usual factory shipments. He moved closer, carefully lifting the edge of the tarp. His breath caught when he saw what was inside. Boxes of factory materials. Raw steel, spare machine parts, even bags of cement. Things that were supposed to be used for production, yet they were packed and ready to be moved out. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had been stealing from the factory, smuggling materials out under his nose. Before Adnan could process it further, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned sharply, fists clenched. Raza stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. Behind him, Kamran and Zubair blocked the exit. "Looking for something?" Raza asked casually. Adnan's blood boiled. "Where is my father?" Raza let out a slow chuckle. "You really think you're in a position to ask questions?" He stepped closer. "You've been playing boss for too long, Adnan. Thinking you could change things, make everything fair." He scoffed. "But fairness doesn't pay the bills. People like me, we make sure this place runs smoothly. We keep things profitable." Adnan's fists clenched. "By stealing from your own workers." Raza smirked. "You call it stealing. I call it business." Adnan's patience snapped. He lunged at Raza, grabbing him by the collar. "Where is my father?" he demanded, his voice filled with fury. Raza didn't look scared. If anything, he looked amused. "Careful, Adnan. You're making this personal." Adnan shoved him back, his breathing heavy. He didn't have time for games. He turned to Kamran and Zubair. "If anything happens to my father, you're both finished." Kamran shifted uncomfortably, but Zubair just smirked. Raza dusted off his collar and sighed. "Relax. Your old man's fine. We just needed him to take a little break, you know? Keep him out of things for a while." Adnan's stomach churned. "If you've hurt him—" "Oh, please," Raza interrupted. "We're not monsters. He's safe for now." His expression darkened. "But you've become a problem, Adnan. And problems need to be handled." For the first time, real danger flickered in Raza's eyes. He wasn't just trying to intimidate Adnan anymore. He was issuing a warning. Adnan knew he had to stay calm, think clearly. His father's life depended on it. He took a slow breath. "You really think you can keep this up?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You think the workers will stay quiet? That they'll keep turning a blind eye?" Raza tilted his head, smirking. "They don't have a choice. Fear keeps people in line." Adnan's jaw tightened. "Not anymore." A slow clap echoed through the storage area. Everyone turned. Iqbal stood in the doorway. His clothes were slightly dirty, his expression calm but firm. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. "Fear," Iqbal repeated, stepping forward. "Is that what you think power is?" He shook his head. "Real power isn't built on fear, Raza. It's built on trust." Raza's face twitched slightly, but he masked it with a smirk. "You're a stubborn old man, I'll give you that." Iqbal didn't flinch. "And you're a fool if you think this ends here." Adnan's breath hitched. His father's confidence was unshaken, but the danger was still very real. Raza wasn't going to back down easily. The tension in the room thickened, as if the very walls were holding their breath. This wasn't over. Not yet. The air in the storage room was thick with tension. Raza's smirk had faded slightly, his eyes flickering between Adnan and Iqbal, calculating his next move. Kamran and Zubair stood rigid behind him, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. For the first time, it seemed like they were beginning to realize that things weren't going according to plan. Iqbal took another step forward, his voice steady. You've spent years controlling people through fear, Raza. But fear only lasts as long as people feel powerless. The moment they stand together, your power disappears. Raza scoffed. Big words, old man. But words don't change reality. A sound came from outside, the unmistakable shuffle of multiple footsteps. Then voices. Workers were gathering. Dozens of them. They had heard everything. Abbas was at the front, his expression grim. Behind him stood many of the workers who had suffered under Raza's rule, their eyes filled with something different this time. Not fear. Resolve. Raza's smugness faltered. He glanced at Kamran and Zubair, but they hesitated. The crowd outside was growing, the weight of their presence pressing into the room like a silent force. For once, Raza wasn't the one in control. Adnan stepped closer, his voice low but firm. It's over, Raza. You've stolen from these workers, threatened them, treated them like they don't matter. But look at them now. They're done being afraid. Raza's hands clenched at his sides. You think you've won. His voice was quieter now, but there was an edge of desperation in it. You think getting rid of me changes anything. There will always be another man like me. Iqbal held his gaze. Maybe. But not here. Not anymore. For a moment, it seemed like Raza might fight back, but then he saw it. The way Kamran and Zubair were no longer standing so firmly beside him. The way the workers outside were waiting, watching, ready to act if necessary. Raza let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Fine, he muttered. You want me gone. I'll leave. He turned to Kamran and Zubair, but neither moved. Are you coming or not? Kamran hesitated, then stepped back. Zubair followed. Raza's jaw tightened. He was alone. Adnan didn't move as Raza walked past him, heading toward the exit. The crowd outside parted slightly, but no one moved aside for him completely. He had to push his way through, forced to face the very people he had mistreated for years. As he disappeared into the night, a heavy silence settled over the factory. It was over. The weight that had pressed down on everyone for so long had finally lifted. Abbas stepped forward, looking at Adnan. What now? He asked. Adnan glanced at his father, then at the workers who had stood up when it mattered most. Now, he said, we rebuild. Together. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just words. It was a promise. The factory would no longer be a place of fear, but of fairness. Just as the tension began to ease, a voice called from the back of the group. One of the younger workers hurried forward, out of breath. Sir, there's something you need to see. Adnan and Iqbal exchanged glances before following him. He led them to a small storage room near the factory's back entrance. Inside, hidden behind stacks of old supplies, were more stolen materials. Far more than Adnan had expected. But that wasn't the worst part. A ledger sat open on a crate, filled with records. Transactions. Evidence that the stolen goods had been sold off. And at the bottom of one of the pages, an unfamiliar signature. Adnan frowned, reading it carefully. This wasn't just Raza's operation. Someone else had been involved. Someone outside the factory. Iqbal exhaled slowly. This isn't over yet. Adnan nodded, his jaw set. No, he said quietly. It's just beginning. Adnan flipped through the pages of the ledger, his pulse quickening with each name he read. This wasn't just about stolen materials. This was organized, calculated. Raza had been the enforcer, but he wasn't the mastermind. Someone higher up had been profiting from this, someone who had stayed hidden while Raza did the dirty work. Iqbal studied the document over his son's shoulder, his expression serious. "Whoever this is," he said quietly, "they didn't expect us to find this." Adnan nodded, gripping the edges of the book tightly. His father was right. Raza had played his part, but this was bigger than just him. If they didn't act carefully, whoever was behind this would try to cover their tracks before the truth could come out. He turned to Abbas, who was watching from the doorway. "Get everyone together," Adnan said. "Nobody touches this room until we figure out our next step." Abbas nodded and hurried off. The other workers had begun gathering outside, whispering among themselves. They knew something was still unsettled. Adnan took a deep breath. "We have to go through every detail," he told his father. "If we can prove this, we can stop it for good." Iqbal placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then let's finish what we started." The next few hours were long and exhausting. Adnan and Iqbal pored over the records, tracing each transaction, matching names to suppliers. The deeper they went, the clearer the picture became. The stolen materials weren't just disappearing, they were being sold to an outside contractor, someone who had been working with the factory for years. Adnan's stomach tightened when he saw the name. Rahim Traders. It was a familiar name, too familiar. The company had been one of their suppliers for a long time, handling equipment and raw materials. They had always seemed reliable, but now everything made sense. Rahim Traders had been working with Raza, using his control over the factory to smuggle goods out while keeping the workers silent through fear. Adnan ran a hand over his face. "I trusted these people," he muttered. Iqbal exhaled slowly. Trust is a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. They had enough evidence now, but the question remained, what would they do with it? If they took this to the authorities, it would mean an investigation, legal battles, and months of struggle. But if they stayed silent, Rahim Traders would continue exploiting others just like they had done here. Adnan knew there was only one choice. By morning, word had spread. The workers knew the truth now, and they stood firmly behind Adnan and Iqbal. Even those who had once been too afraid to speak had found their voices. Adnan made the call himself. He reported everything: Raza, the stolen goods, the connections to Rahim Traders. By noon, investigators had arrived, and the factory was filled with officers collecting evidence. The workers watched as documents were taken, interviews conducted, and for the first time in years, they felt something new: justice. Raza was caught trying to flee the city. His arrest was swift and quiet, but the impact was loud. Rahim Traders, once considered a respected business partner, was exposed for its corruption. Contracts were cancelled, investigations expanded, and within weeks, their entire operation collapsed. The factory, however, stood stronger than ever. With Raza and his men gone, the workers felt a shift, a sense of belonging. They were no longer just employees. They were part of something bigger. Adnan knew rebuilding wouldn't happen overnight. There was still work to do, trust to rebuild, systems to improve. But he also knew he wasn't alone. With his father by his side and the workers standing with him, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: certainty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Adnan and Iqbal stood outside the factory, watching the workers leave for the day. There was laughter now, conversations that weren't hushed whispers. The weight that once loomed over them was gone. Iqbal crossed his arms, a small smile playing on his lips. "You did good, Beta." Adnan shook his head. "We did good." Iqbal chuckled. "So, what's next?" Adnan looked at the factory, the people, the future ahead of them. "We build something better," he said. "Something worth being proud of." Iqbal nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. "Then let's get to work." As the last of the workers walked out, the factory doors closed behind them, not as a place of fear, but of hope. And for the first time in a long time, Adnan knew, this was only the beginning of something greater.